Well, 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 back again I see. What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you the inverse of yesterday's video, talking this time about games that really surprised me, generally positively, as they went into them with certain expectations, and those expectations were exceeded, and thus, for one reason or another, I had a great time with them. Now, curiously enough, in fact, I would not say many of these games are actually my favorite games, but probably once a year or so, I usually make a video talking about the games that were in fact better than I expected that year, as I have reviewed hundreds of games at this point, and yet some of them always manage to surprise me nonetheless. With that in mind though, with this particular video, I wanted to go a little bit further back than that. For instance, just in May I talked about some of the games I played this year that were surprisingly good, games that were better than I expected, that kind of thing, and so what I want this video to be is actually about a lot of old games that I've played previously, and by old I simply mean, like a year or two back. But as always, at the start of these videos, what you expect going into a game is a big deal in regards to how you wind up feeling about it. For instance, many of the games I would actually consider my favorite games, I went into expecting them to be pretty good, they were very good, and thus expectations were met, not exceeded. And hopefully that makes it a little bit clear about how some of these are different. But in addition to covering sort of the opposite subject yesterday, another big reason that I wanted to cover this particular topic is that I am currently going through Battle Brothers to review the title after people had been asking me about it for years. And for our first entry, it is probably fitting then that I let people know that I am having a great time with Battle Brothers, and while I am not nearly close to done with it, still quite a bit of game ahead of me. It has become pretty immediately apparent why people were wanting me to check it out so much. I mean, this game just has me written all over it, which is interesting because I've played games inspired by this, like War Tales, for instance, and one of the reasons it took me so long to get around to this one, as this game initially released back in, I want to say it was like 2017, but I had, seen the procedural map and the way the tactical maps and stuff looked, and I was like, oh, it looks pretty cool, but that combined with how long I knew this game was going to wind up taking me to review, which is why I'm getting a lot of videos like this out lately, wound up seeing me put it off, and happy to report that the audience was definitely right on this one. I'm having a blast with it, and while I went into it expecting it to probably be pretty good just based on the recommendations, I've been regularly having to force myself to stop playing this because it really feeds into that loop of just one more contract, one more battle really, really well. And you combine that with just kind of the nature of boosting up your mercenary party and watching those brothers that you take on and recruit kind of grow, both literally in terms of power and equipment, but also in terms of their bonuses or just traits, that kind of thing. So for example, one thing that happened the day I'm recording this, actually, I had a mercenary who was afraid of greenskins, which is orcs and goblins in this particular game. But I had been fighting so many of them as part of the greenskin invasion that there was just a text event where he just kind of got over it. Basically faced his fear to the point that he was no longer afraid of things, and that on top of the great writing for things like the contracts and the invasions and the crises, that kind of thing. I am having a much, much better time than I expected, and I'm looking forward to continuing to play this one. But we are ultimately just kicking it off here because next up I actually want to talk a little bit about Divinity Original Sin 2, because while this game is definitely one of my favorite games, it did in fact massively surpass my expectations. It surprised me a great deal. The reason for that being is that I was actually kind of working my salaried sales job when this game released, and I saw some marketing materials for it, and I was like, oh, that looks cool. Started playing it, thought it was incredible. It reminded me that I had been so caught up with, working this job and all of the other normal adult stuff, and I was like, oh man, I used to really love this genre of games and playing them. What is all of that about? And I've talked before about how there was a pretty big period there where I just kind of didn't play a lot of new releases for just normal reasons, really. But ultimately, I loved Divinity Original Sin 2 so much that not only did I start covering Divinity lore super heavily on the channel, and I was like, man, I gotta go back and play all the other games in this franchise. I need to know everything about this, which I then went on to share with everybody that watched those videos, I suppose. But but it also inspired me to get back into playing this genre and of course starting to rediscover older games that had released during that period where I wasn't playing games. And for all of that, I would say Divinity Original Sin 2 is one of, I would say, probably top 3 most important games that I've covered in terms of like making this channel what it is today, which was obviously pretty big for me at the very least. But going from me just kind of seeing some promotional material for a game to it becoming sort of all-encompassing and then leading to the growth of this channel in many ways is, I think, about as surprising as it gets, which is why I wanted to include that one in particular. Keeping it moving though, next up I wanted to talk about Aliens Dark Descent. So, I admittedly not like a huge Aliens guy. I am obviously kind of familiar with the franchise just because of how big it is, but I wouldn't claim to be like a super fan or anything like that. But what makes this even more interesting is that Aliens Dark Descent is a fantastic game. However, I didn't even know it was releasing until like maybe 2 weeks beforehand. I remember that I read some comments on some videos asking me if I was going to cover it, and I started doing some research, and I was like, oh, this actually looks pretty neat. But yes, I went on to have a blast playing this one. So, Aliens Dark Descent, if you are unaware, is actually a sort of TRPG, really, but it uses real-time with pause, which is a rare breed for that genre. But it also incorporates a bunch of other mechanics, like trying to monitor the sort of alien hive activity, that kind of thing, and basically trying to be very proactive in your defense against all of these potential threats, while also moving through a level but trying to keep the awareness of the hive to your presence to a minimum, because they'll beat you through overwhelming numbers eventually. All makes for this like super challenging experience that was at the same time like really suspenseful in the way that it presented these aliens, and that on top of just fun that you could have with getting to grips with your team and the people you were sending out there who could obviously encounter things like various traumas as they're trying to deal with all these aliens and stuff, and it all just made for an incredible experience. So to go from not even knowing a game existed until just a couple weeks before it was about to launch, to it being one of my favorite games that released in 2023 was obviously a pretty big leap. That game surprised me a great deal, like many others on this list, and that is why it is, of course, here. Perhaps a slightly different shift in direction here, with our next game being Marvel's Midnight Suns. Now this is an odd one, because while I ultimately gave this a buy on sale, it did actually surprise me in one incredibly specific way. You see, Midnight Suns is kind of split in between 2 games. What you do in terms of like friendship simulator stuff back at the Abbey, and then the actual battles themselves. The battles use like a deck of cards for basically each individual character, and then you can combine that with some general actions that are in the environment of where you are. I'm pretty on the record about not really enjoying card building mechanics, that kind of thing, and so I went into this honestly not expecting much, but people just kept asking me to cover it, so I did, and much to my surprise, the combat is my favorite part of that game. It is actually very, very good. So going into something fully expecting to probably not enjoy it because of what it was doing, only to then have the particular spin that they put on it in this game to not only be good, but actually really, really fun at the same time, was obviously very surprising. And I think it's a shame then that they kind of tied it to that weird friendship simulator at the Abbey, because that part of the game felt much less interesting as a result. But nonetheless, I can safely say that I really enjoyed about half of that game. But let's keep it moving because we've got some more to cover. This next title is one that I really only covered after a lot of insistence from the audience, which, I mean, to be fair, you may be noticing a trend here at this point, and that is none other than Armored Core 6. So, this combination of like mech builder meets action gameplay was honestly just not the kind of thing I was sure that I would enjoy, and happy to report, though I would say most people know, at this point Armored Core 6 is a ton of fun, both in terms of actually utilizing your mech, the gameplay side of things, but also just like messing around with different parts and combinations and toying around with the exact setup you want for a particular mission, and of course feeling how those individual changes changed how you actually played the game. So that is to say, like actually customizing your mech and then seeing the changes you've made to that mech actually realized in terms of tangible gameplay differences was just really cool, to be honest. Especially with how granular you could get with some of that, and how some of the equipment, of course, gave you like special abilities, that kind of thing. And then you combine that with the fact that, while I wouldn't say there's like a lot of choice and consequence exactly, you can actually play through the game multiple times to get different endings and and things. In fact, you'll have to for the true ending. And seeing things change as you go through those particular playthroughs just kind of gave you an opportunity to even further mess with that customization and stuff. And overall, it was just an incredibly enjoyable experience for a series that I was not familiar with at all and didn't go into expecting very much of. Next up, let's take it in the complete opposite direction with a very tiny game that I guarantee at least a few of you have never heard of, which is none other than Betrayal at Club Low. Betrayal at Club Low is like my favorite hear me out of video games. It is such a bizarre, awkward little experience, and I honestly love it. It's real short. I'm pretty sure I 100% it in less than 10 hours even, but basically you work for some secret organization that puts you in the role of a pizza delivery guy, and you have to use a bunch of pizza and pizza dice to affect your stat rolls and things as you work your way through various conversations to get into this nightclub. So you can try to rescue an agent who has gotten himself trapped there, and this leads to a bunch of different outcomes and endings based on how everything goes while you go try to do that. And like many people, I took one look at this game and went like, I don't even know what this is, but you know, whatever. I got some time to kill and I'll check out the demo that they have, and happy to report that I was just pleasantly blown away by all of the different options they had available to you, just all the different things you could find and how you could utilize your various skills in this short little like one-shot version of a strange TTRPG. If you've never tried it, there's a demo over on Steam. That'll probably be more helpful than I was specifically, as it's a hard game to describe, quite frankly, but if you wind up liking it, they're actually working on a second game, kind of in the same universe, if you will, called Moves of the Diamond Hand, and you better believe I'll be reviewing that when it drops. Still a few more to go here that I want to mention. Next up, I actually wanted to talk about Elex. So in yesterday's video, I talked about Elex 2 and how it was very disappointing, but that I loved the original Elex. Well, when I first started Elex, it was actually my very first Piranha Bytes game, and while they're obviously, or at least were I suppose, a very prominent developer in the sense that they made a very specific type of game after their initial hit with Gothic, they kind of struggled to find their footing after that, which continued all the way until their closure in many ways, I would say, but my first exposure to them was ultimately Elex, though I have played all their games since. Now, I actually first played Elex because, again, people asked if I was going to cover it because it seemed like the kind of thing I would probably enjoy, and once again, the audience had it, though strangely, it did actually take a while to hook me in. That game gets off to a bit of a rough start, as many of Piranha Bytes do. They don't exactly make a great first impression. And my first impression was mostly that this was just like a weird, janky little mess of a game, and truth be told, I still kind of feel the same way about it. And yet, somewhere between trying to make nice with all of these different factions that inhabit this strange world as you go from being a weak little useless baby to actually being somebody who can hold their own here, in no small part due to the equipment available from the people who are going to come into your path here, the very same people who actually kind of make this feel like a properly fleshed out world in a way the sequel never quite managed to do. And suddenly I found myself towards the very end of the game, kind of about to head into the final section, wrapping up companion quests, that kind of thing, and I remember the exact moment where I was just kind of sitting there and I just kind of randomly thought to myself about what a great time I had been having. So while it did take a little while, it ultimately grew on me. I loved it. And while to this day Elex remains a little hard to recommend for many of the reasons I've just talked about, if you can get past some of that initial roughness, I think there's a real diamond in there. I had a lot of fun playing this one. Third from the end, we then have Expeditions Rome, which is actually my game of the year from 2022, which people may or may not remember. I've mentioned Expeditions Rome once or twice here and there. Unfortunately, not too much of a reason to talk about it these days. Like the studio Logic artist that made it went out of business, but then like reformed as Campfire Cabal. I don't know if Campfire Cabal is still around. At one point they said they were working on the next Expeditions game, but like simply put, I don't know what's going on there anymore. But what I do know is that Expeditions Rome is a ton of fun. It's kind of a weird blend between the two sister genres of TRPGs and CRPGs in a way that I think works really, really well. In addition to, strategic army battles, as you are effectively like a historical stand-in for Julius Caesar, alongside just regular old turn-based tactical battles, you can actually explore individual locations and take on like proper quests and stuff, meet characters characters, there's a bunch of romances involved, there's interludes where you find yourself in Rome as an example. And while I would certainly not call this by any stretch of the imagination like a AAA production or anything, it is extremely good. From romancing Cleopatra to playing out various sieges of important locations, it was just from start to finish a blast of a game, which is why obviously it was my game of the year all the way back in 2022. And while I don't know what's going on with the developer or anything these days, I sincerely hope we get another Expeditions game at some point. And yes, before someone asks, the previous entries, Vikings and Conquistador, are games that I will maybe eventually get around to. Rome was great though. Second from the bottom, we have none other than Octopath Traveler 2, my runner-up to Game of the Year for 2023. And to remind anybody who has forgotten, my actual Game of the Year in 2023 was Baldur's Gate 3, but Octopath Traveler 2 was so good, it was right up there. Now, coincidentally, I don't really have a lot of experience with the original Octopath Traveler. I'm aware of it, I've seen bits and pieces of it, but it's not a game I ever finished. But I knew I wanted to jump in to the sequel just because of course, what limited experience I had with the original title, and I was pleasantly surprised with just how much they really kind of crammed in here. For starters, I really love the HD 2D art style. I know some people are mixed about it, but personally, I love that art style. I think it fits these types of old JRPGs extremely well, and I always love seeing it. So there's that, but I also think the individual character stories for each of your party members was really well done. Surprisingly, the merchant actually wound up being my personal favorite. The second one probably being Hikari, with third probably being Thrones, I would say. But it was incredibly fun to explore. There's all of these locations and like cities and stuff, people you could get into. There were interactions you could have with those characters, so you kind of actually did feel like you were traveling around, properly interacting with the world. There was a day-night cycle. You had to track down all your party members, do their stories and stuff. And while some of the pacing here and there could be a little bit rough, for the most part, I loved Octopath Traveler 2. And for a game that I was just kind of mildly interested in, to be my runner-up to Baldur's Gate 3 in 2023, I think you kind of get the gist here. I loved it, and before anyone asks, yes, I am very, very aware that Octopath Traveler 0 is releasing this December, which is actually going to be a prequel to the first one, I believe. So of course I will be playing that. But that does finally bring us to our very final entry for this particular video, which is none other than Nioh 2. So last year, 2024, saw the final updates for Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, which is my favorite game of all time. To coincide with all of those final updates, I spent an enormous amount of time making final videos, updating things, that kind of thing. Now the reason I tell you that, which might initially seem unrelated to this, is that Wrath of the Righteous was my most played game every year since it released from 2021 to 2024. It won't be my most played this year because it finally wrapped up content and I've obviously just had to cover other things. In spite of all of that, Nioh 2 was my second most played game in 2024. I love what they did with the combat system there. Now, I had played Nioh previously, had a pretty great time with it, obviously expected good things out of Nioh 2, but frankly, I think Nioh 2 was so good that I don't even think Team Ninja has really been able to properly follow it up since. Every single one of their combat systems beyond this one has felt less in comparison. I was really blown away by just how much they enjoyed it. I was initially a little skeptical about them removing the living weapon from the first game in favor of like the shifts in this one, but even that wound up feeling supernatural, especially like the burst counters. But it's definitely the type of game you could spend an enormous amount of time just sitting there and perfecting your build and everything, and while I think some of that wears a little thin in the final New Game Plus cycle, especially where they kind of expect you to focus on applying this confusion status effect by applying other status effects, and it gets to be like honestly a little too meta for its own good at that point, for me at least. It still nonetheless does in fact have a combat system that kind of deserves it, honestly. So there's just so much depth to it between the stances, all the yokai shifts, all the combos, the weapon types, just everything. There's just honestly too much for a video like this to really cover properly. But I'll say that you could easily play it for hundreds of hours, regularly swapping through like different builds and play styles, and just continually having pretty different experiences in terms of the combat system in particular. It's tremendous, and like I said, not even other games from Team Ninja have come close to this for me, which is why I'm hoping Nioh 3 is finally what eventually surpasses it. But between that, the incredible character creator as an example. You had a real winner, which is why I played it so much last year. And I'm looking forward to the next title's release. But that is finally going to be the end of this particular video. There has been a bunch of games that were quite a bit better than I expected heading into them, much of whom were in fact recommended to me by, of course, the audience, who it seems actually does have a pretty good idea of the type of things I would like to enjoy. So when I say thank you this time around, understand that I truly do mean it, because as much as I have hopefully, through my reviews and things, given people the opportunity to learn about games before they purchase them and hopefully had a good time with them, reality is that's kind of a two-way street. I have been put on to so many games by recommendations from the viewers, people like yourself watching this, that I am immensely grateful for. I've had so many great experiences directly because of all this, often to my own surprise. But with that, I certainly hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But truly, thank you so much for giving me all these experiences and sharing them with me along the way. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.